Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about speed, not the Keanu Reeves bus movie, but in the physics sense of how fast something moves. When it comes to vehicles of any kind, really, there's always going to be people that push things to the extreme. Those that push the envelope either in an attempt to push technology and society forward, or in an attempt to feel that adrenaline rush. For military vehicles, it's definitely more the former, pushing technology forward to better a country's military capabilities and have better equipment than your potential enemies. For military aircraft in particular, increasing speed can be viewed as one of the bigger drivers of experimentation and innovation. Not so much anymore, as the brunt of the focus in manned aircraft is on things like stealth and advanced computer systems, but for a great deal of aviation history, we can see this quest for speed. So, this quest for speed takes us to our subject for today, a Soviet project in the early 1930s to make the fastest plane Russia had ever seen. In this endeavor, speed was absolutely the core concern, and everything else was secondary. The result was this, the Bartini Stal-6. Before we talk about this plane itself, though, I want to briefly talk about the man behind it, Robert Bartini, because his life was absolutely bizarre. Born in the Kingdom of Hungary in 1897, Bartini was born into nobility and was quickly removed from it. His father initially refused to recognize him as his son, which directly led to Bartini's mother taking her own life. Then his father would finally recognize him as his son and promptly handed him off to a poor peasant family. Bartini would then participate in World War I for the Austro-Hungarian army as an officer, where he was promptly captured by the Russians in mid-1916, where he would remain imprisoned until 1920. After being freed, Bartini would then move to Italy, receive citizenship, and join the Italian Communist Party. It was here in Italy that his interest in flying seemed to begin, as he attended flying school in 1921 and began studying aerospace in 1922. Once Mussolini rose to power in 1922, though, Bartini was then sent by the Italian Communist Party to the Soviet Union, where he would gain citizenship there and began working various aviation-related jobs, from simple airport work to work with the Soviet Air Force and the Red Army. He would work these various jobs until 1938, where he was then arrested for being an enemy of the people, and he was accused of being a spy for fascist Italy. While he was imprisoned, Bartini was actually able to continue his aviation work and help design aircraft that would see extensive use by the Soviets during the Second World War. He would then be released from prison in 1946 and continued to work on aircraft design in the Soviet Union until he died in 1977. Now, most of that wasn't really important to the Stal-6 here, but the man had a very strange relationship with the Soviet Union throughout his life. So anyway, on to the Stal-6 proper. Sometime in the early 1930s, Bartini was hired by a research wing of the Red Army, specifically the OOS, which stands for this. Try to pronounce that at your own peril. I'm not even going to try. Bartini was given control over his own design team to make essentially whatever he wanted. All projects would need government approval to advance past the design stage, though. In this role, Bartini wanted to make the fastest Soviet plane in existence, something that a former Soviet test pilot compared to, and I quote, a beautiful naked girl. Bartini and his team would present their design to the Soviet government sometime in the early 1930s, and permission to proceed on it would come a full 18 months later. Measuring in at just under 7 meters long and 9 meters wide, the design of the Stal-6 very much looks like a futuristic design, being kind of round and bulbous looking. As the primary focus was speed for the Stal-6, the fuselage was designed only to encase the engine and the pilot, doing their best to balance aerodynamics and minimize weight. The engine would be fully encased apart from some small slots for airflow and ventilation, and the cockpit would be integrated seamlessly into the fuselage, creating an unusually smooth-looking design. To further reduce weight, just a single manually retractable central wheel would be located behind the engine. To ensure that the plane did not tip over while on the ground, each wingtip was outfitted with manually retractable skids. Powering the Stal-6 would be an American-designed steam-cooled V-1570 Curtiss Conqueror with around 630 horsepower. To help save on weight and overall engine bulk, the radiators that would normally accompany such an engine were replaced with a more complex evaporative cooling system. How this system works is that whatever coolant they were using, whether it be water or something else, would be able to cool until it began boiling and turned into steam. The steam would then be funneled into specially designed wing compartments away from the engine, where it would be allowed to cool down. Once it cooled and became a liquid again, it was then pumped back to the engine and the cycle could continue. As the Stal-6 was experimental and was only intended to have a high top speed, no weaponry of any kind would be outfitted, at least not yet. The body of the plane, as the name Stal-6 suggests, was mostly made of metal, steel specifically. Stal is the Russian word for steel. The frame of the plane, from nose to tail, wingtip to wingtip, was made of steel alloy tubing. The skin, apart from the tail, was made of an aluminum-magnesium alloy, and the tail was covered in either plastic or wood laminate. The wings would have an additional layer of stainless steel plating that created the evaporative cooling system that the engine used. Now, as for the plane's cockpit, you may be wondering how that works, as being completely flush with the rest of the fuselage, the pilot can't really look forward. Because they didn't want the bump that a normal cockpit would have, Bartini & Co. designed a workaround. On takeoff, the pilot and his seat would actually raise up, just enough for his head to poke out in a small opening between the cockpit glass and the fuselage. Once they were in the air, the pilot and his seat would sink back down into the fuselage, and instead would now see through two small ports that extended above the engine and out of the front of the nose. While this did certainly reduce the pilot's visibility, it did help make the Stal-6 more aerodynamic, which was the goal, so whoever flew it just had to deal with not being able to see very well. And in October 1933, two pilots, A.B. Yumashev and P.M. Stefanovsky, had to deal with that lack of vision as the Stal-6 would fly for the first time. Again, high speed was the intent, and high speed is what they got. Reaching upwards of 261 miles an hour, the Stal-6 was now the fastest plane the Soviet Union had ever seen up to that point. Compared to the Soviet Union's main fighter plane at the time, the I-5, the Stal-6 was nearly 100 miles an hour faster. Apart from that exceptional top speed, there was really little else of major note, good or bad. The only other major test was of the cooling system, where part of it was disabled to see how well the plane would perform if the cooling system were damaged in some way, and they found that it still performed rather well. And yet, despite performing rather well, the Stal-6 as it stood would not progress further. For one, while the cooling system was shown to work even with this simulated damage test, the evaporative system was viewed as being overly complex and just more difficult to maintain on account of being so spread out and using all these extra pipes and chambers. This wasn't an issue unique to the Stal-6 either, as other countries like Germany and Britain had also created similar engine and aircraft designs and came to the same conclusion. While this type of design did make higher speeds possible on account of the engine not being as bulky as it would be otherwise, it was a general consensus that this cooling system was just too finicky to really be worth it. Additionally, in the next few years, new, better engine coolants made steam-cooled engines obsolete, so this complex internal setup of the Stal-6 would actually be pointless in just a few years' time. Arguably, though, the bigger issue was the cockpit and its lack of visibility. With the pilot only being able to see directly in front of him through the very small viewports and directly above him with the cockpit glass, any performance benefits brought about by its more aerodynamic design would certainly be offset by the fact that the pilot wouldn't really be able to see much of anything. If the Stal-6 were to be a fighter plane, for example, then that complete lack of visibility would in all likelihood be its end. So when Bartini and his team, despite the Stal-6 not being adopted, decided to try and make a fighter variant of it, the Stal-8 in 1935, some major changes had to be made, 3 of them to be specific. For one, the engine would be swapped out with a more powerful VK100 with around 1,000 horsepower. The steam cooling system of the Stal-6 and the old engine remained. 2, some guns would actually have to be added. 2 7.62mm SHKAS machine guns were located in the nose, presumably around where the vision ports were located. And 3, the cockpit would have to be raised slightly to improve visibility. This ruined the rather unique-looking flush look of the old cockpit, but if it was to be a fighter, the Stal-8 had to be practical. Presumably, the Soviet government approved this design and allowed it to proceed into the prototype phase. However, right before the prototype Stal-8 was finished, the Soviet Air Force swooped in and canceled the project, citing the overcomplexity and inherent vulnerability of its steam cooling system. No further iterations of this Stal design was pursued, and thus officially ended the Stal-6 and Stal-8 and its super-fast unicycle design. As one final note, I want to take a quick look at what the Stal-8 may have become if it was allowed to continue. Since the evaporative cooling system was deemed to be too finicky and vulnerable, I think it's safe to assume that it would have been changed to a more conventional cooling system, in line with most other aircraft at the time. This would also likely lead to an alteration of its body design to fit the new cooling system. With these changes, the Stal-8 probably would have evolved to look like a relatively standard fighter plane. Perhaps the only significant difference between it and other planes at the time would be its mono-wheel and skid design. So, taking the plane into World War II, I think the Stal-8 would have been a relatively unique-looking design with its mono-wheel, but otherwise probably would have just blended in with the rest of Soviet fighters. But at the very least, the Soviets would have a unicycle plane to go along with all of their bears. If only for that reason, I think they should have continued on with the Stal-8. Alright, and with that, I think we'll go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So, for the past month or so, I've actually been recording audio for all of my videos while sat on a bucket, like a Home Depot bucket. Problem is, my computer chair is getting a little bit squeaky, and the bucket was the closest thing I had to hand that I could sit on, other than the floor, I guess. And it works pretty well, all things considered. It's not squeaky. Not the most comfortable thing, but, you know. So, anyway, though, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.